If a Chief Justice can cut off a member of Congress the moment she speaks about voting rights, whose voice do voters still have cold white light spills over the most solemn courtroom in America? Jasmine Crockett stands squarely at center stage, a red suit like an exclamation point facing the black robes of 9 justices. Chief Justice John Roberts, 18 years with the Gavel, a lifetime appointment, has just cut her off. Congresswoman, that's enough. The words ricochet off marble walls like a prohibition. Crockett's gaze doesn't waver. One hand rests on a copy of the Constitution. The other grips a stack of Texas voter files. People who were stopped right at the threshold of the ballot box. This is no longer procedure. It's a stress test on the limits of power, and a survival question for democracy itself. Who gets to speak when the ballot is under threat? She exhales half a beat, then steps forward half a pace, the distance between submission and dialogue. Her voice cuts clean through the air, steady and clear, with all due respect. Mr. Chief Justice, the Constitution does not permit you to silence an elected representative speaking about voting rights. Silence falls like a curtain, and then the legal frame snaps into focus. The 15th Amendment protects the vote from racial discrimination. The 14th Amendment guarantees equal protection, not slogans. The Supreme text, in 10 short minutes. Crockett shows that sometimes, to keep faith with the promise of the ballot. All you need is to read one line and stand firm in the face of a commanding nod. If you want more stories like this, where knowledge and composure meet concentrated power. Hit subscribe and join the Jasmine Crockett File community. We bring you political moments that don't just shock, but genuinely inspire. The camera eases back into the chamber, settling on the dark wood interior that absorbs every breath and whisper. At 42, this freshman Congresswoman from Dallas carries herself with the confidence of someone who has spent years as a civil rights attorney and state representative. Known for her direct, no-nonsense style, she has quickly made a name as a rising voice on constitutional questions, especially voting rights. The very issue at the heart of today's hearing. Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice. And may it please the court, she begins, her voice deep and steady. Filling the room. I stand before you today not just as a Congresswoman, but as someone who has seen with her own eyes how the destruction of voting rights has taken away the voices of communities across Texas. And across this nation. She pauses, meeting the gaze of each justice in turn. Then continues. The case before you isn't about technical rules and regulations. It's about whether we still believe in the basic promise that all Americans deserve equal access to cast a ballot. Roberts shifts slightly in his chair, his expression unchanged, but his eyes tightening just a fraction. The sort of movement you notice only if you're truly watching. This hearing, Williams v. Texas Election Commission, was never meant to be a headline maker. It's technical, about voter ID requirements, the kind of case Roberts might have expected to pass with minimal public scrutiny. But Crockett's presence changed the calculation, drawing national media and packing the courtroom to the walls. Crockett steps a half-pace to the side and points toward the chamber's display of the Constitution when the Voting Rights Act was gutted by this very court in Shelby County. We were told other protections would remain. Yet here we are, 10 years on, watching the very forms of voter suppression the VRA was designed to prevent. The audience tightens as Roberts leans forward, his microphone picking up a quick, sharp inhale at her direct reference to one of his most controversial chapters. The stakes clarify in an instant. This isn't about one case. It's a challenge to the Roberts Court's entire approach to voting rights. Justice Elena Kagan glances at Roberts, then back to Crockett, as if she can see the confrontation gathering. Justice Thomas sits motionless. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson leans in, clearly locked on every word. The political contours of the court begin to sketch themselves in real time. The Texas law before you today, Crockett continues, her voice gaining muscle. When 23% of black Texans lack the narrow form of ID this law demands, compared with 4.7% of white Texans. We're not talking about neutral regulations, Crockett says. We're talking about a modern-day poll tax. Roberts' jaw tightens. Cameras catch the discomfort. This is not the dry. Technical exchange he anticipated, Crockett is speaking in plain language about racial disparities, and she's doing it with receipts, specific numbers grounded in constitutional principles. Congresswoman, he cuts in. Tone clipped. Please stick to the specific legal questions before the court. The warning lands like a boundary line on the marble. Crockett nods, but doesn't yield. Mr. Chief Justice, the specific legal question is whether this law violates the 14th and 15th Amendments, and you cannot answer that without confronting these disparities. She turns a page without missing a beat. When 87-year-old veterans who voted in every election since Korea are suddenly turned away, that's not a paperwork issue. That's a constitutional crisis. A burst of murmurs ripples through the gallery. Bang. The gavel snaps the room silent. Now the confrontation is fully in the open. A freshman congresswoman and former civil rights attorney against a chief justice who has helped reshape the law of elections. This is no longer a footnote about voter ID. It's a fight over who defines the meaning of constitutional voting protections. Reporters' fingers fly across keyboards. On cable news, a lower third is already framed. Showdown at SCOTUS, Crockett versus Roberts on voting rights. Inside the chamber, the tension keeps ratcheting as Crockett methodically maps the terrain. Barrier after barrier, county after county. She gestures toward the exhibits. In practice, here's what happens. She explains, voice even and unhurried. In counties with higher black and Latino populations, DMV offices, the places you must go to get a valid ID, have shorter hours, longer lines, and they're often miles from public transit. She lets the sentence breathe. That's not coincidence. It's a pattern. A beat of silence. The data sits there. Heavy. The stakes are no longer abstract. Equal protection and the right to vote against the friction of real-world logistics that decide who gets a ballot and who turns around at the door. If this is the kind of clear-eyed, source-grounded analysis you want more of, make sure you follow along. Tap subscribe and join the Jasmine Crockett file. Here, we cut through the jargon, put the Constitution back at the center, and track the cases that shape your vote. She lets it hang. This isn't an accident, it's a pattern. And it repeats across the state. Roberts shifts, subtle, but telling. For years, he has preferred to frame voting rules without the lens of race, emphasizing states' rights to run elections. Crockett forces the conversation he's tried to avoid. Congresswoman. He cuts in again. Sharper now. The court is aware of the general statistics. Please address the specific constitutional test that should apply. It isn't just a procedural redirect. It's an attempt to move the debate off lived experience and back onto abstract doctrine. The gallery tightens. This is the first clean clash between the Chief Justice and the freshman Congresswoman. Justice Amy Coney Barrett glances at Roberts. Justice Sonia Sotomayor leans forward, eyes on Crockett. Crockett takes a sip of water, nods. Mr. Chief Justice, I am addressing the test. Under Arlington Heights and what remains of the Voting Rights Act, discriminatory impact combined with historical patterns creates a presumption that requires strict scrutiny. She hasn't yielded an inch. Instead, she nails evidence to precedent. Roberts's face tightens almost imperceptibly. The court is well versed in the precedents. Congresswoman, with respect, Your Honor, precedent only matters when it is actually applied. In Brnovich, This court acknowledged discriminatory impact, yet upheld Arizona's regulations. I'm establishing why the severity here requires a different outcome. A low wave of murmurs moves through the room. Crockett has touched a live wire. Another Roberts Court decision seen as weakening voting protections. Cameras catch Justice Elena Kagan give the smallest nod, while Justice Samuel Alito frowns. A split-screen moment built for virality. Roberts taps his mic. Congresswoman Crockett. This court decides cases based on constitutional principles, not policy preferences. Please continue with your legal argument. The tone turns dismissive, almost condescending, an unforced error that only heightens the stakes. Crockett pivots to her strongest ground. Then let me show you what constitutional principles look like in real life. Your Honor? She signals to her aide. Folders move down the bench. Before you are sworn statements from 72 Texas voters who were denied their right to vote despite multiple good faith attempts to comply with this law. She held up the first statement. Mary Wilson, 84 years old, born at home in East Texas in 1939 when birth certificates weren't commonly given to black babies in the Jim Crow South. She's voted in every election since 1965 but got turned away in 2022 because her name on her baptismal certificate, the only record of her birth, has a different middle initial than her Social Security card. Crockett moved to the next document, James Fuentes, a disabled veteran who couldn't renew his license because the only DMV within 50 miles of his rural home isn't wheelchair accessible. They told him to drive to the next county. With each example, Crockett was doing something powerful, connecting abstract legal principles to real human experiences, making the constitutional violations impossible to brush off as mere technicalities. The gallery was completely captivated, and several journalists were openly recording every word. Robertson's patience was clearly wearing thin. He glanced at the clock, then interrupted again. Congresswoman, individual stories, while compelling, don't establish a constitutional pattern. We need to address the legal standard, not emotional appeals. The dismissal of these voters' experiences as emotional appeals created exactly the opening Crockett had been waiting for. She straightened her shoulders, looked directly at Roberts, and delivered her first truly confrontational response. Mr. Chief Justice, with all due respect, the Constitution wasn't written for abstract legal theories. It was written to protect real Americans like Ms. Wilson and Mr. Fuentes. When the 15th Amendment says the right to vote shall not be denied or limited based on race, it doesn't include an exception for inconvenient facts or uncomfortable truths. The gallery exploded in whispers. Justice Jackson looked up sharply while Justice Thomas, usually silent, whispered something to Justice Alito. The confrontation had now escalated beyond procedural disagreement into fundamental questions about how constitutional principles should actually be interpreted. Roberts' face flushed slightly as he reached for his gavel. Congresswoman, I'll remind you that this is a legal proceeding, not a congressional hearing. Please maintain appropriate decorum rather than backing down. Crockett nodded and doubled down. Appropriate decorum, Your Honor, includes acknowledging the human impact of constitutional violations. I'm not here for abstract theory. I'm here because real voters in my district are being systematically denied their most fundamental right. She turned to Justice Barrett. Justice Barrett, in your confirmation hearing, you said the right to vote is a fundamental constitutional guarantee. Yet the law in front of you today has demonstrably prevented thousands of eligible voters from exercising that right. How can that possibly survive constitutional review? Roberts immediately stepped in, his voice sharp. Congresswoman Crockett, you will address your arguments to the court as a whole, not individual justices, and you will stop asking the justices questions directly. The tension in the room hit a breaking point. Roberts was now clearly frustrated, having tried multiple times to control Crockett's presentation without success. The constitutional separation of powers was being tested in real time. A Chief Justice trying to assert control over a member of Congress who flat out refused to be silenced. Crockett nodded again, but her expressions stayed resolute. "I apologize for the direct question, Mr. Chief Justice. Let me rephrase for the entire court. How can any law that demonstrably prevents thousands of eligible voters from casting their ballots possibly survive review under the 14th and 15th Amendments?" Roberts leaned forward, his patience clearly exhausted. "Congresswoman Crockett, you have repeatedly disregarded the court's guidance on how to present your argument. If you cannot follow this court's procedures, your time will be cut short." The threat hung in the air. A Chief Justice threatening to silence an elected representative of the people during a hearing about voting rights. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the gallery where several civil rights leaders were sitting. Cameras captured everything, including the reactions of the other justices, several of whom looked uncomfortable with Roberts's approach. Crockett stood perfectly still for a moment, then reached into her folder and pulled out a document nobody in that room expected. A copy of the Constitution itself. "Mr. Chief Justice," she said, her voice now calm but firm, "before you cut my time short, I think we should both refresh ourselves on a document that comes before both your authority and mine." The Supreme Court chamber fell into an intense silence as Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett held up the Constitution, her steady gaze locked on Chief Justice Roberts. The moment crackled with tension. A freshman representative facing down the nation's top judicial officer with the founding document between them. Mr. Chief Justice Crockett began, her voice clear and unwavering. Article 1 of this Constitution establishes Congress as a co-equal branch of government. When I speak here today, I'm not just doing so as an attorney before the court, but as a representative of 750,000 Americans whose voting rights are directly affected by this case. Roberts' expression darkened. "Congresswoman, your status as a member of Congress doesn't grant you special privilege in this courtroom. All advocates before this court are subject to the same rules." Crockett didn't hesitate. "With respect, Your Honor, it doesn't grant me special privilege, but it does grant me a constitutional duty to speak for my constituents when their fundamental rights are being threatened." She held the Constitution higher. The founders created 3 co-equal branches specifically to prevent anyone from silencing another. The gallery erupted in murmurs. Several justices shifted uncomfortably. Justice Kagan's eyebrows went up slightly, while Justice Souttar leaned forward with obvious interest. Roberts's face flushed with barely contained frustration. He tapped his gavel sharply. "Congresswoman Crockett, this is my final warning. Address the legal questions before this court, or I will end your argument. What happened next would become the moment replayed on every news channel within the hour." Crockett, instead of backing down, carefully opened her copy of the Constitution to a marked page. "Mr. Chief Justice," she said, her voice now stronger and more deliberate, "I am addressing the most fundamental legal question before not just this court, but our entire democracy. Article 1, Section 2 establishes that members of Congress directly represent the people. The 15th Amendment prohibits denying the right to vote based on race, and the 14th Amendment guarantees equal protection under law." She took a step closer to the bench. "When you threaten to silence me for speaking about how my constituents are being denied their constitutional right to vote, you're not just violating court procedure, you're embodying the very constitutional crisis I came here to address." Complete silence fell over the chamber. The confrontation had moved beyond a mere disagreement about courtroom rules. Crockett had masterfully reframed the entire exchange as a constitutional struggle between branches of government, with herself defending democratic representation against judicial overreach. Roberts sat motionless, clearly caught off guard by this constitutional framing of his attempts to control her presentation. Before he could respond, Crockett continued, her voice gathering strength. The Texas law before you today has prevented an estimated 278,000 eligible voters from casting ballots. In my district alone, 42,000 voters, predominantly Black and Latino Americans, have faced barriers that the 15th Amendment explicitly forbids. This isn't about procedure, Your Honor. This is about whether the Constitution's promises are real or just theoretical. She turned to address the full court, a tactical move that prevented Roberts from appearing to be her sole opponent. This court has said that voting is preservative of all rights. If you rule that states can create barriers that demonstrably prevent hundreds of thousands of eligible Americans from voting, particularly when those barriers disproportionately impact racial minorities, then what exactly does the 15th Amendment protect? Justice Jackson nodded almost imperceptibly, while Justice Barrett appeared to be taking detailed notes. The dynamic in the room had completely shifted. Crockett was no longer on the defensive. By appealing directly to constitutional principles, she put Roberts in the position of seeming to oppose the very document they'd all sworn to uphold. Roberts moved to retake control. Congresswoman, your time is nearly expired. Please conclude. I'll conclude with this. Mr. Chief Justice, Crockett replied, her voice steady and amplified by the quiet. This Texas law demands IDs that 23% of Black Texans and 27% of Latino Texans don't have. Compared with 4.7% of white Texans, it shutters ID offices in minority neighborhoods while keeping them open in predominantly white areas. It rejects tribal IDs while accepting gun licenses. She met the eyes of each justice. If a law systematically prevents one racial group from voting at 3 to 5 times the rate of another, it violates the plain text of the 15th Amendment. And if this court can't see that, it isn't interpreting the Constitution. It's rewriting it. Roberts' face hardened. Congresswoman Crockett, that's enough. Your time has expired. The moment crystallized. An attempt to cut off an elected representative speaking about constitutional voting protections. An act that would draw swift condemnation beyond these marble walls. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She simply held up the Constitution. Chief Justice. This document does not give you authority to silence an elected representative discussing the 15th Amendment in a voting rights case. That amendment exists precisely because those in power have tried to silence the fight for equal representation. Share your take in the comments below. I'm listening. If this reporting resonates, please like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss what comes next. And check the featured video on your screen, the story I'm most proud of. Thank you for your support, and see you next time. We are Jasmine Crockett File.